Okay, welcome to this third Francqui Chair lecture on gesture interaction by Professor Jean Vanderdonckt. Last week we have actually we learned about various pitfalls if you design your interactions, and I think the lecture today we'll actually see how you can do so-called elicitation studies to actually get the best gestures from your users. But I'm sure Jean will very soon tell us what this word means and how you use that actually. So just for as last week, I would ask you to turn your microphone off while Jean is presenting, just to have the good audio quality. But if you have any questions, you can raise your hand, and normally Jean will see that, and you can raise your question during the presentation. So Jean, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for your introduction, Bert, and to everyone. So welcome aboard this third lesson from the Francqui Chair on Gestural Interaction. I hope that you can see now my screen. I forgot to include the sound. Sorry, just a minute. I have to go back. Always include sound, otherwise when you will see the video, you won't hear anything. Okay. So welcome about this presentation, which is about the question, how can we get the best gesture from people, I mean from average end users, not from ourselves. And what does it mean best? Because of course to have the best gestures, we need to combine several criteria. So as a starting point, in order to raise the question, how can we can gather these gestures from the real people who will be using the system, I'd like to start with a case study, a little bit old, but anyway, I think it's still the case, which is about a system for sketching a graphical user interface. So here on the left, you can see that instead of drawing a graphical user interface by dragging widgets from a palette and then dropping them onto a canvas, which is the typical approach for a user interface builder, here this user, who is a designer, is sketching on a tactile screen with a stylus how he would like to see the user interface. And from that, the system interprets its gesture and we generate code from that. So here is a small demo of that. So this software is called SketchXML for sketching things. So first of all, when you open, it's a Java application. So first of all, you have to create, of course, a kind of profile for what you want to draw on which platform. I'm trying to go to full screen, but it doesn't want. No. Anyway, I'm trying to get full screen. So in this case, of course, this is a little bit accelerated, but not that much. You can see that this designer is just writing things on the canvas. And whether he's interested or not, he can trigger the automatic recognition of the gestures so as to create a real user interface afterwards. So some of them, you can see that the gestures are recognized. Sometimes you don't want to do it because you want to preserve the naturalness. For instance, if I stop it here for the moment, you see that the labels like personal data, zip codes, and gender, they are not, for the moment, recognized, although it could be, because the designer prefers to focus on the design and not on the recognition, and not to be disturbed by the system trying to recognize what is drawing, sketching, or writing. However, you can see that for some of the gestures, they are beautified and then they are transformed into a shape that is recognized and then attached to a widget, like a button, a radio button, a group box. So here is an example of the different so-called levels of fidelity, is that in the end, the system is able to automatically generate code in HTML, in Zool, or in Java, corresponding to the sketch. Let me go back just a few seconds more. So here is the first level. We'll sum up on that in a few seconds. The first level is the actual sketch or draw that has been produced by the designer. So this is exactly what it drew on the surface. The next level is the so-called beautification. For instance, the system has recognized some zones, some circles, some labels, some buttons. So this is the first level. Second level, it is then beautified. Of course, for the moment, we didn't apply alignment or proportional beautification, but at least you can see that the size are more or less okay. And then in the end, you have the real user interface. Of course, since it is just a sketch, there is no label or there is no constraint imposed on those widgets. But it's really a user interface. What is also interesting is that the system recognizes about 30 different widgets, ranging from labels, multi-line labels, edit fields, radio buttons, checkboxes, push buttons, drop-down lists, and so forth. But then if the end user is not happy with this gesture, the system can learn a new gesture for any widget. So here is the user interface. You can see on here on the different tabs what are the parameters and the different representation for each widget. So if you click on any of them, let's say for a push button, you can see the representation of them. Just a minute. And you can add, replace, or add your own. So here is an example where the user wants to add another representation. And when it is added, the system has learned and recognized here it is a combo box, for instance. So if the user is happy with the existing gesture, it's okay, like this one. If it is not happy, then the user can introduce a new gesture and add a new representation or replace an existing one. So you can ask maybe, okay, sketching is nice for a graphical user interface because it is visual by nature. But once I have sketched my, let's say, dialog boxes, windows, or web pages, I need to have at least some behavior, some navigation. So you can do that as well. In this panel, you can add arrows specifying point and click interaction, like if I'm clicking on this push button, it will close this window and open the next one, or it will close the initial web page and open the next one, or it will superimpose. And this is what actually works now. If you go into simulation mode, if I click on this push button, then it will display the next one. Of course, as you can see, it's just a prototype. Nothing is complete for the moment. But you can add some more behaviors in this way. And of course, the designer can continue adding screens, and then it generates, well, this is just for the information, it generates code in a language called UseXML, which stands for User Interface Extensible Markup Language. So in principle, you don't need to see that one, of course, but if you really want, you can. So now, as you have seen, in this sketching application, the designer is working with a predefined representation, a predefined gesture, or he may want to add another one. So what did we do for that? So the question is, how did we determine the best gestures for representing those widgets? Some of them are pretty straightforward, like for instance, a group box can of course be depicted as a rectangle with a label, usually on the top left corner, although maybe if I'm a left to right or right to left interface, I may want to move the label on the top right, or even why not in another direction. If I'm using another language which is not necessarily left to right but top to bottom, So here are different representations that has been selected for these widgets. So how did we do that? How do we decide that? And how do we determine that these gestures, these representations, are appropriate enough? So these are the three levels that you have seen. Here is an example of a screenshot where a person just sketched something, but it is of course very incomplete. So this is the level 1. So there is nothing in there. But you can notice here there is a very nice slider, so you can easily move from one level of fidelity to another one. So when there is none, you have this display. If I'm moving my cursor to the next level, to the low level, then the system attempts to recognize what is already sketched and displays by superimposing the name of the widget or the object that has been recognized. So you can see that, for instance, here is the progress bar, but this strange shape has not been recognized, so it is left as it is. On the other hand, here you can see a list box. A list box is depicted as a rectangle with two tiny triangles included on the top right and the bottom right in this case. So this is when I'm clicking on low. So even without changing anything, if I click now on medium, I will have this beautification where objects are a little bit already made more graphical, but not yet as appropriate as I want, and there is no alignment yet. And if I click on high, this is referring to the highest level of fidelity, then I can see a real graphical user interface here with Java look and feel. And I can change even the look and feel. So for instance, if I want the look and feel of, let's say, a workstation like OSF Motif or Linux, I can choose another skin. So and I can switch between these levels at any time. So in order to determine those good representation, let's say, as an example, this is what actually the designer has drawn on the panel with his stylus. It has been recognized as a list box. Although the sketch was not very precise, it is being recognized. Then it is beautified into this shape. And sometimes designers are using this as a very, very early prototype or even sometimes for documentation. Or you can go to a real one. So here is a list box with imaginary values. So how did we do that? Initially, we used a very simple method called the Deborda count method, which is a particular case of Condorcet. So I'm sure that you have probably heard or even used that. So imagine that we collected a series of representations from different participants. So we ask them, please give us a gesture, a representation for all of these widgets. Let's say, for instance, here you have representation number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we collected them, we collected those representations from a series of users, and then we took, let's say, the most frequent ones. Let's say, for instance, we kept the 5 most frequent representation, but we can go for more in this case. That was the first step. In the second step, we asked participants, well, in this set of those 5 representations, which one do you prefer? So it is based on preference. So for instance, participant number 1 would say, my favorite representation is representation number 3. So for each choice, a score is attached, which is called the Deborda score. And since we have here 5 candidates, each participant should assign a score, which is equal to the number of candidates, which is 5 here, minus the order. So for instance, here, I'm sorry, no, the first one is this one. So if I'm trying to highlight that. So the first choice is this one. So participant 1 selected representation number 4 as the best one. So, n, which equals to 5 minus 1, gives a score of 4. Then the second most preferred representation is this one. So in this case, it's no longer minus 1, but minus 2, which gives a score of 3. And so forth until all candidates are exhausted. So this is the second one. The third one is this one. And this representation got a score of 2, then a score of 1, and then a score of 0. So the Vanderdonckt method is just you assign a score that is highest for the most preferred one, and then by decreasing order, for instance, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or 4, 3, 2, 1, and then 0. That's for the first one. The second participant, of course, did the same, but may have, of course, a completely different preference. So in this case, participant number 1 prefers the representation number 1 instead of number 4. So in this case, a score of 4 is assigned to this representation. Then the second one is this one, and it then receives a score of 3. So this is a mistake. It should be 2 here. So there is a mistake. I made a mistake in the copy paste. Anyway, so we collected all of these scores for the representation. And of course, we need to have a series of participants, not just 2. And then we sum up all these scores in order to identify, let's say, the 3 most preferred representation. For instance, this one receives a score of 7, for instance, and this is just imaginary. So this is the best one. Then the second one receives the score, and then that one, and we discard the other one because their score is just too low. So in the end, we kept representation number 4, number 5, and number 1 as the most preferred gesture for representing those widgets. And this is what actually is the case. Here the list box now is equipped with 3 representations in the software, and those 3 representations are recognized, but not the other ones. Of course, we could add more representation, but then in this case, they are not very much consistent, and it also increases the complexity. So this is one method that we used a long time ago, and which is still okay, but there are now today more advanced techniques. One thing that I wanted to emphasize also, based on the discussion that we had last week, is that that was, of course, for the preference coming from the user, but we have also to take into account the system point of view. And for that, we computed the recognition rate. So it means that we ask again, as far as I remember, something like 30 different participants to draw these representations. And then we checked whether the system was able to recognize the gesture or not recognize it. As you can see, the straight line received the best score. In 97% of cases, it has been properly recognized, not surprisingly, because this is a very simple one. And the lowest one is the toggle button, which consists of a rectangle containing another rectangle that is divided into 2 parts. So the recognition rate is pretty much very good until, I would say, here, because usually we consider that all the recognition rates which are above 90% are considered acceptable. Well, this one as well. Now, if we look at, that's one thing. If we look at the physical configuration of each widget imposes a series of constraints. Like, for instance, here the straight line, whether I'm sketching from left to right or from right to left, it doesn't matter. So there is no problem about specific orientation. However, in this case, for that representation, I need to have to represent the checkbox, I need to have the rectangle at the left and the label at the right, since the label is that one. So there is a specific orientation that is probably needed in this case. Other constraints could be also included, like complex inclusion, for instance. In this case, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 objects included in the rectangle. So we have 4 inclusion constraints to be satisfied. If, for instance, by chance or by mistake, I am not drawing those 2 lines inside, but maybe crossing the border, the object will not be recognized. So there are some cases where constraints are really impacting the usability of the gesture. So we performed usability analysis and analysis of variance, well, whatever the figures. What is important is to see that when objects are included into others, it dramatically impacts the sketching time, but also, so how much time do I need to sketch or to produce a gesture, but also how many mistakes I can do. For instance, if I'm trying to draw, if I'm going back here, if I'm trying to draw this widget, which consists of a rectangle with 2 inside, 2 lines, and then 2 triangles, if I made some mistakes because the triangles are not located properly, then the system, the gesture will not be recognized. So as we can see here, there are 3 things that impact the recognition, but also the overall complexity. So first, how many inclusions, whether there is a sequence between objects, and also the amount of shapes, not surprisingly. The more shapes that I have, the more time I need to produce, but also the more errors I may want. For the other ones, like tiling things or overlapping things, or even simple inclusion or orientation, we didn't find any correlation, which means that fortunately, whether the person is sketching a gesture in one particular order or not, it doesn't matter. Like, for instance, if I'm drawing this gesture, if I'm producing the rectangle, the triangle, and then the circle on top of it in this order, or the other way around, if I'm producing first the circle and then the triangle, it doesn't matter. However, here, this gesture consists of 2 shapes with at least 1 constraint, which is the overlapping here. This is represented here. But fortunately, this constraint overlapping is not impacting the gesture.
I have a technical question, Jean.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, it relates to something I asked last week. Do you use and it seems so the gesture information, so the timing and the different orders of the things, to state that, for example, the 3 sides of the triangles belong to the same shape just because they've been produced in sequence, and then the circle is different because it's been produced at a different time. So do you just analyze the shape, but also the sequence?
So in order to recognize this, for instance, so of course we recognize the shape, but if for instance I'm drawing first the triangle and then the circle, it doesn't matter the order, but they are associated because they are produced within a certain time frame, which is depicted by a so-called technique called sliding window, which means that those 2 gestures could be produced in a certain time interval, otherwise they are considered as 2 different shapes.
Widgets, you mean?
Yes.
Sorry.
Well, in this case, if I let's say if I'm drawing first a triangle and then a circle this way, then the time frame is more or less in the same well, or the two shapes are recognized one after another in a short amount of time between them.
Okay, and then second question, in your analysis, do you distinguish?
One more thing.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, go on.
No, but if I'm drawing first a triangle this way, then if I wait, let's say 5 seconds, and then I am adding this the system then considers that these are two different widgets. But there is only one exception on that, is that, yes, for instance, here you can see the text field is depicted as a rectangle with one line inside because it's a one-line text field. But the multi-line or the text area is exactly the same as a rectangle, but with two lines or even more. So what is interesting, just in that case, but that's an exception, is that if I'm, let's say, if I'm now drawing a one-line text field, it will be recognized like this. And if later, let's say 5 minutes later, I'm adding a second one here, then the system can detect that this gesture has been produced on top of another one. And then we'll treat this new as a text area. Even more, if I'm adding after 5 minutes, for instance, those two triangles here, then the system will detect that those two triangles have been added on top of another one, and then it will be transformed into a list box. But these are just two exceptions.
And
you wanted to ask another question.
Yes, it was about the recognition technique. So does it work by decomposing the shape, which in the case of the triangle and the circle is made of two simple geometrical shapes? Does it work in that way, or is it more holistic? It takes the whole shape all together.
In this case, there are two approaches. Is that first, any shape is described as a grammar. So for instance, a triangle is really described as three straight lines which are connected in this way, and a circle is described in this way. But for other gestures that, well, I don't have any examples here. Let's say a spiral, for instance, something like this. I'm not drawing very well with my mouse. This cannot be described mathematically. So in this case, the gesture or the template is captured as a series of points. So for instance, if I'm, let's say, okay, I'm trying to produce this gesture, a spiral. So there is no mathematical representation. Well, of course, I can describe a spiral with a mathematical function, but this is not understood by the system. So in this case, what happened is that, let me try to find out another pointer. Then the system will capture a point here, a point there, and then on the curve, there are a series of points which are captured. And then we will later apply pattern matching techniques, for instance. Does this answer your question?
Yes, more or less. So it means that for the figure, so for the figure with the triangle and the circle, you would produce a kind of intermediary symbolic representation, which states that this is made of a triangle and a circle, and maybe they are overlapping, something like that.
That's right.
Okay.
And this is recorded in XML in a grammar behind the curtains.
Okay, thank you.
But for the spiral, we can't. So in this case, it's just a series of points.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So interesting.
When shapes are recognizable, like straight lines, circles, triangles, rectangles, or I think we have up to the pentagon, but not beyond. We could also introduce, for instance, the hexagon, but we never use it.
Okay.
So what do we have until now is that, as we have seen just a few minutes ago, what we did is that we asked people for preference, right? And we see that, of course, the more preferred gesture, then the more comfortable or the more usable they should be. We have seen that also the sketching time counts and how many error or delete operations are produced by the end user. And on the other hand, we know that there is an impact on that on the recognition rate from the system. But this is not enough. To know what is best, it is to have the best gesture. It is much more complex than just a question of preference. I can even come up with a gesture that is maybe very good very well preferred with a low sketching time and not too many errors. And still, the gesture is not good enough. not just because its recognition rate is not good, but also for other reasons. So that was our starting point, and some years ago. And there is another method which is taken into account the preference in a concept called agreement or interjudge agreement, which is a familiar concept in psychology. Well, I'm not a psychologist, I'm sorry, but I know that in psychology and in sociology, they are using the concept of interjudge assessment or interjudge agreement, or even in statistics, pretty much. This is a pretty much familiar concept. So in order to get the most preferred gesture from users, we can of course apply all techniques like Wizard of Oz, and one of them which progressively emerged since now 10 years is the so-called by elicitation. So elicitation by definition comes from the verb, at least in English, which is not easily translated into French, or maybe in another language, I don't know. But to elicit, according to the Merriam-Webster definition, it is trying to call forth or to draw out something. Like, I'm asking somebody, please give me something about that, or please react on that, or please answer to that. So a person would be triggered, stimulated by something in order to propose something, and this process is called the elicitation. So if we generalize this, for instance, in software engineering, there is a sub-area called requirements elicitation, which means that we ask people or the future user of the system, please give me, what do you think about your future system? What would you like? What do you dislike? What are your preferences? What are your needs? What is really key for you and what you don't want to have at all? So in general, the elicitation is a process where we try to acquire some information from a person who is typically a real end user, or maybe a representative of this person, or a group of persons, in a way that we will not impact directly the rest of the system based on that. So we don't want to disclose the intent. We discuss with the person, and of course the person knows that this information will be used in order to shape the future system, but it is not specified so that there is no risk of asking people to do something that they don't want, or sometimes they are scary because if I say, well, if I say A, then the system will be like that and I'm scared about that, or if I'm telling B instead of A, then they try to evaluate or to compare that, and they are not behaving naturally. So elicitation is really a technique, or is a very straightforward, as you will see in a minute, to very discreetly, gently ask information from people, but not readily available for a specific purpose. We just ask them, and what do you think about that? And then we collect. So this process has been used by Jacob Brock since now a very seminal paper published in 2009, which is about using the technique of elicitation coming from sociology applied to gesture, and this is so-called today a gesture elicitation study. So let me describe a little bit the protocol of that method. So a gesture elicitation study is a study where we ask end users or potential users or representative people of the future user to elicit, that is to ask them, what are your own gestures for a set of predefined functions? And since the system does not exist yet, the functions are represented by reference, which is a simplified representation. If you remember, in my case, in my example of the sketching, each widget was represented in a way that it looks like a real widget, but of course it was not. So the advantage of that technique is that we ask people to elicit the gesture they want for a function, and we just ask them, what kind of gesture do you want for that? And then we collect that in a very structured way. In the end, we want to come up with a vocabulary of potential gestures. And from all of these proposals, we have to identify which are the most preferred gestures. We will not keep all of them, otherwise there will be hundreds of gestures. So the final output is so-called a consensus set, because this is the set of the most, not only preferred, but the most agreed upon gestures. So for that, we need to define, as usually, a context of use, which we usually define as 3 things. Who is the user? What kind of platform or device is she or he using? And where is it? For instance, if I'm, let's say, I want to rent a car. If I'm a business person running in the airport with my smartphone, this is one context. The user is a business person, the device is a smartphone, and the environment is an airport. So that's one context of use. But here, usually we perform this type of study in a natural setup, usually a smart home or representation or usability laboratory, or at least in a room where we can control things. So how the advantages of this study is that it is very quick, it is very efficient, the setup is straightforward, it is, in one word, it is really easy and cheap to execute. However, there are several disadvantages, but I will come up with those limitations later on. The most important advantage is that it is really easy to do and it is cheap to run. You don't need a lot of resources, you only need people, basically. So let me show you the protocol that we are using now. So first step, we have, of course, to prepare a sampling of the population, and this is why we can, of course, use many of them. We can randomly select people, or we can perform a systematic sampling. It means that from some population we treat this one, that one, or we can sample population by a criteria, like by age, by gender, by background, or whatever. So here we try to get a representative sampling of the population. And of course, we try, but it's not always possible, to have a sampling that is really representing the population. So for instance, in this case, this is a statistics of a population who is using more or less electronic devices belonging to Internet of Things. So it means that between 18 years old and 24, only 9% of the population is using, let's say, Internet of Things devices. In this age range, then we have 15%. Then a little bit older, we have 16, and then so far until 100. And then we try to decompose it also in female and male, so as in the end to have here how many participants do I want in which age group. So this is of course a constraint, or otherwise we just ask the experimenter, please gather, let's say, 20 people, and that's it. But of course, in this case, the sampling will not be so representative. So usually what we try to do is at least to find 30 participants. Alors, why 30? This is it's a big debate about how many participants we need. Some of my colleagues from marketing say that usually you don't have any marketing study with less than 30 people. And then I'm asked why? Oh, because this is usual practice, because it's a rule of thumb, and that's it. Then another colleague who is a statistician told me that 30 is a key value resulting from a theorem from statistics, which is the theorem of the central limit theorem, and which gives a good distribution. So we tend to have at least 30 people. ideally more or less 50-50, different ages, different backgrounds, and different levels of experience. So we invite those 30 people, usually in a very consistent setup, where, for instance, in a room or in a usability lab or in an office, and each session takes up about 30 minutes. So usually it proceeds like this. Since we have to find out the best, or according to the preference of the agreement of the user, what kind of gesture would you like? We have to define a series of functions. So let's imagine that I want a gesture for turning the TV on and turning the TV off. Or I want to pump up the volume of my media player, or I want to turn down the volume. So we define a list of so-called functions, and we do it by name. Like, for instance, I want to start a media player, or I want to answer a phone call if I have a smartphone, etc., etc. Of course, some of those actions could be familiar. For instance, almost everybody now has a TV, maybe not a smart TV, but at least almost everybody is familiar with a television. However, in Belgium, we are not very familiar with air conditioning. So when we ask people, please give us a gesture for turning the air conditioning on or off, they say, oh, I never used any air conditioning system in my life, apart maybe in the car, so I have no idea. Whatever. So first we define a series of functions for which we want to have the gesture. Then we randomize them, and we represent each function as a referent. So a referent is let's say, a materialization, a graphical, vocal, or even multimodal materialization, representation of a function. For this, so this is an example taken again from Wobrock and colleagues, which represent here a referent for, let's say, for formatting a paragraph in a word processor. So here you have a screenshot of a famous word processor. You have a line in there, and you have the screenshot before the action and after the action. And in the middle, you have the description of the action. So if I have, let's say, this sentence, and I want to increase the indent of that sentence, maybe I want to put it on the right, or I want to put it on the left, or I want to put it in the center, then the system displays what is the state before executing the action and what is after. So in this case, it is a right alignment or a maximal indent. So the referent is a materialization, a representation of the function. But since well, in this case, it's based on screenshots, but we can invent many different ways. Since the system does not exist yet, we are at design time, we have to be creative. So the referent could be text. For instance, please give me a gesture for turning your TV on. That's one way. And then there is no graphical representation. It could be graphical, like for instance here, we have drawn a representation where we have, let's say, we have this setup of various screens. And after performing permute files, it means that the red document which was here is now on the bottom right display. The blue one is moved there, and the yellow one is moved there. So in this way, we expect to see the situation before permuting files and the situation after. So again, it takes time. The graphical representation is more explicit. So the advantage is that it gives the participant more guidance. But the drawback of that is that as soon as we give an example, people are always concentrating on that example and maybe or may feel a little bit more constrained. Sometimes we also do an animation, which means that, for instance, in this case, the blue document, which is here, is moved to that screen. The red document, which is located here, is moved to that screen. Sometimes we are also animating that. But again, on one hand, the advantage is guidance, but the drawback is it constrains the vision or the creativity of the user. Another thing that is also important is that, as you can see here, we are sometimes using devices that are not very well used. We will see that later, that this is a drawback called the legacy bias. So sometimes we are using devices that are not so frequently used, like this one, for instance, which is an interesting device. So this device is as you can see, this is a new device that can be attached to the main screen of a laptop or a monitor, and then you can expand laterally on the left, on the right. And this is a device that is sold by a Belgian company called Slide Enjoy, which I really recommend because it's a nice one. So people are not very used to see this kind of device. So this is called visual priming because it gives them a context of how you can use this device, but of course it doesn't tell them how to use it with gesture. So when we use those reference, of course we show them this video in order so that people will have an idea of how this device will look like or how they can act on it. But of course the video should not suggest anything about gesture. So it provides some context, but that's not. So again, we prepare the software, the hardware, and we try always to record everything in log files. For instance, here there are some different applications for that. I'm not detailing that. It is also very important to have a physical location where we conduct the elicitation. It could be anything. It could be an office, a room, a usability lab, but we try to keep it constant throughout the experiment so that people will behave as natural as possible, if possible, of course. Then before the experiment, of course, as usually for any experiment, when the participant arrives, a consent form should be signed, some demographic data should be captured, and we ask them a motor skill test, which is, if you can have a look at my hand, this is a typical test. Also, for instance, for people who are playing music, they have to touch the tip of their thumb to all the others once, 2 times in a row, but as quick as possible without any problem. So if I'm doing this, in principle, I should not have, or I should not suffer from any motor problem. Otherwise, maybe the person could not participate. Then what happens is that during the experiment, each participant is presented one referent at a time, which is randomly selected, may have some time to think about a gesture, like, of course, this may need some time, and we give the participant, okay, now you have time to think about what kind of gesture would you like for this referent. And when this person has found a gesture in her mind, says, okay, I'm ready. Then the participant is producing the gesture. It could be a gesture with the device or without, by simulation, gives a rating called goodness of fit between 1 and 10, and gives some other values for other scale like complexity, memorability, or fun. For instance, do you think that your gesture is funny, which may be appropriate for a game, but not for a professional application? Or do you think that you will remember your gesture next week? Maybe not, so maybe 1. Or no, this is very easy gesture. For instance, the spiral, I will always remember a spiral, so no problem. So after that, we capture a series of measures. First, the thinking time, how much time the person needs to think about the gesture. Then we also capture the goodness of fit. Let's say from, okay, I think I've proposed a very good gesture, or it is too complex, or difficult to memorize, but it's a funny one. And we keep everything on video in order to keep that for later analysis. Then we can ask maybe other questionnaires like IBM, etc. So I'm not detailing that here. So after that, we repeat that for a series of people. And then after the experiment, we have to classify the gesture. So for that, there are several classifications possible. One of them, erase. One of my favorite classification is this one. So gesture ML is, for me today, probably the best. No longer gesture ML. I'm sorry. It just disappeared. Ah no, it's there. Oh my God. I just checked a few days ago and it's well there. Maybe it's gesture ML. I'm sorry, I checked a few days ago and apparently it disappeared. Anyway, so on this website, all the gestures of the human body are classified with a name that always adopt a simple sentence, which is a verb, an action one. What kind of lamp is it related to? And maybe some parameters like raise my hand forward, backward, right, left, or a combination, or punching, folding, on top, throwing. So all of these gestures needs to have a classification. Maybe this I will skip for a minute. And for each gesture that has been elicited, proposed by people, we give them a name and we can also have a representation. So here is an example of a picture of somebody who has proposed a gesture for ring-based device. So a ring-based device is like this. So an interesting device that has been proposed some time ago by a Japanese company called Logbar was the ring device. Let's say, maybe I have some pictures over there. So it's like a ring, as you can see here, and you can click on a small button. You can roll the ring. You can move it. You can, of course, perform mid-air gestures. Unfortunately, this Japanese company is no longer releasing this interesting device, not because it was a bad device, but because the gesture recognition was not very accurate. So people were happy to produce gesture with the ring, but many people complained that even for simple gesture, it didn't work enough accurately. So here, for instance, with your smartphone, you can train the system with gestures in air, like maybe here a spiral or a loop. And the system records that and attach some actions. Like, for instance, imagine that you have your smartphone on the table, it's ringing, but it's too far away. Or maybe you want to transfer something and you want to answer the phone call. So instead of reaching the smartphone, you can make an action maybe on the ring remotely. So the problem is not the gesture, the problem is that those gestures are not very accurately recognized by the system, and this is why Logbar has withdrawn this device, unfortunately. But that's their problem. So we try to give a name to do all of these gestures, like maybe rotate the ring on the finger, or rotate the finger wearing the ring, or even rotating the hand with the ring. We can, since it is equipped with a sensor, there are many possibilities. Let me show you an example, and I think I should go a little bit further, and then I will go back. Okay, so here is an example of a series of gestures that have been captured for the ring device. So as you can see here, this person has the freedom to take one ring device or two, to put it on which finger do you want. So usually this is the index, but you can put it on any other finger, maybe not the thumb because the thumb is a little bit larger. And then we collect all of these gestures like this way. You can see on the top right what is the red hovering down. Previous item. So in this video, you have seen a series of gestures which have been elicited from people in order to use the ring device. So let's go back to that. And then, of course, we have to continue the classification. And there, last week, I explained several possible classification. One of my favorite is the Eigner classification, where a gesture is roughly falling into one of those 5 categories. So pointing, which means a person is pointing to something. A psychologist says it is a deictic gesture because we point maybe to an object, maybe to a position, to a person, or even I'm pointing to a part of my human body. So it could be static in the sense that the hand is adopting a pose, but the hand does not move and the fingers do not move. It could be dynamic when the hand keeps the same configuration but move. For instance, if you can see on my camera, if I keep my hand open and then I'm moving left, right, forward or backward, this is a dynamic pointing. Stroke, for instance, I'm swiping something, tan, tan, tan. So that's for semaphoric. The third one is so-called pantomimic, because we try to mimic something that belongs to the real world. Like if, for instance, I'm taking a cup of coffee, I'm drinking it, okay? But if I want to do something similar, I may want to reproduce the same gesture, like turning an object in a way that looks like it is a glass or a cup of coffee. Then we have iconic. An iconic represents a gesture that is always attached to a symbol, like drawing a circle, or giving a dimension, or giving a distance, or a shape, or even a letter or a symbol. For instance, if I'm drawing something, or if I want to say this is this size, or this is small, or this is medium, or this is large. And finally, manipulation. For instance, manipulation is the most complex type of gesture. Is that, for instance, I want to manipulate objects. Like, for instance, if I'm using this device, I may want to group them or to ungroup them, or I can open it, close it. So these are manipulation gestures. So there are several classification criteria. I will not detail them here. Also the distance. For instance, if you consider again the ring device that you have seen some minutes ago, I can perform the device quite close to me, maybe at 10 centimeters. In this case, we will say that the range of motion in this case is the closest one, which is close intimate, up to 15 centimeters. If it is a little bit more far away from my human body, let's say until more or less 50 centimeters, it is still in my intimate area. So in principle, nobody can enter this intimate area or volume, but it still belongs to me. Up to 1 meter, more or less, it is considered personal. After that, we have other distance which depicts different levels of motion. For instance, if I have my hand with my arm completely deployed, raised, so in this case, it will be probably a social gesture. But if I'm pushing here, close to my human body, the push gesture is still the same, but it will be considered as a personal gesture. If I'm pushing far away from my human body, I'm still pushing, but it will be considered social. So maybe in order to push some object that is shared among people. Another criteria is the laterality, which has been defined as follows. For instance, if I am a right-handed person, I may want to use the ring device. Well, I don't have the ring device here, but I may want to use my dominant hand for putting the device. And as you have seen in the video, usually people put the ring on their index, although they could put it also on other fingers. But of course, those 3 fingers are the most mobile, the thumb, the index, and le majeur, I don't remember now in English. Those 3 fingers are the most mobile ones, unless I'm a magician. So this is dominant, but with 1 hand. I can use, of course, my non-dominant hand. I can use my 2 hands in a symmetric way, like this one, or asymmetric way. So in this case, it's called asymmetric bimanual. It is interesting to notice that, of course, people tend to prefer dominant unimanual and then symmetric bimanual, which are the 2 most favorite categories. But sometimes they are using also asymmetric bimanual or non-dominant, but these are usually exceptions. So there are many criteria like that. For this purpose, now you can use a very interesting application called AGAT, developed by Radu Vatavu, in order to compute a so-called not preference, but an agreement now. So in the past, we have been talking about preference of gestures, but that's an individual character. So with the agreement, we want to go 1 step further beyond preference and say how many people agree with each other to say this is a good or the best gesture. So then we have to prepare something. I will not detail that now. And there is an agreement rate to be computed, which is depicted as a as a formula like this. So the agreement rate, the idea behind that is how many pairs of participants agree with each other to say that this is a good gesture, yes or no. So independently of the formula, which may look like a little bit complex, but it is not, let me show you an example. Well, here. So imagine that I have only a few people, participant A and participant B. So in order to compute the agreement rate, we need to compute how many people are in agreement with each other. I'm sorry, it's not A and B on the proposal. So let's imagine that we have 5 participants. And of course, as you have seen in the video, even with the ring device, people are proposing many, many different types of gestures. So this is a drawback. So in order to come up with the most agreed gesture, we need to compute the rate, which is how many pairs of people are agreeing with each other to say that this is a good gesture. So here we have 1 pair of users. 2 of them suggested the gesture A, but we have also 3 users who proposed the gesture B, which means in this case I have 3 pairs, 1, 2, and 3, but here I have only 1. So after computing those pairs, we come up with a percentage which indicates the level of agreement. So here is an example again that we can do it with the ring gestures, and this is the ring. So we had 1 on the left hand and 1 on the right hand. So they could use 2 if they want. In the video you have seen that we had 24 people. They had to use 1 ring or 2, and they had to propose gesture for all of these reference. In this case, in this experiment, we didn't show them anything. We just tell them, please give us a gesture for, let's say, a next item, previous item, turn the TV on or off, and that's it. So which means that in this case, we have collected a large amount of gesture proposals, and then we have to classify them. So after computing the agreement rates, we can see that, for instance, with 1 ring or 2 rings, the rate could be different. So for instance, after computing those rates, we can notice here that for the next action, about 1/4 of the population, 22%, agreed with each other to say that gesture A was the most appropriate for them. But that was for 1 ring. Surprisingly, when they were using 2 rings, they were not so much in agreement. Only 15% of the people agreed with each other. So this is, of course, for the maximum. And if I'm taking another one, like say for switching the TV on or off, about 12% of the population agreed with 1 gesture, with 1 ring, and 6%, which is very low, for 2 rings. So from that we can identify which gestures are the most agreed. And in the end, based on that, this is now here a catalog of the final gesture that has been selected from this analysis. So instead of having a very large amount of gesture proposal like here, some of them were just discarded because they were not proposed by many people, and some others were, of course, kept because of the agreement rate. So in the end, we came up with a so-called consensus set, which gathers the gestures that are the most commonly agreed among people. Of course, this is only with the population sampling that we had. So here we have, with 1 ring, we have those gestures, and with 2, you have another one. Like, let's say, for instance, here, where is rolling the ring counterclockwise, or rolling the ring device on the finger in a clockwise way. So these are examples. And then once we have this consensus set, we have a new set of gestures that is considered appropriate, but of course according to one measure. Here is another example where we collected gestures for the Google Soli. Here in this case, for turning the light on, about 20% of the population was in agreement to say that the splay gesture was the best one. So it means that if I'm opening my hand like splaying, and each finger is of course then like an explosion, so 20% of the population agreed that this is the best gesture for them. That was for turning the light on. For turning the light on. For turning the TV on, then they say that they want to push on one of the fingers, like acting as a button. So according to the scale, until here, the agreement is so-called medium agreement, and beyond that, the agreement is usually considered as low. You can see with this link another link and see other examples. So we have to analyze those gestures, and there is a lot of possibilities by criteria, by agreement rate. This is what we did, by interview, by questionnaire, and in the end we come up with a consensus set like this one for the Google Soli device and this one for the Ring device. So now I would like to give a full example, and then I want to a little bit analyze those things a little bit further. But before doing so, I would like to come back on you and maybe see if you have any question or any comment so far. So please feel free to take the microphone if you want. Any reaction on that?
Maybe just a small one, because you mentioned the device and you just showed also the Google Soli. So do you think, I mean, this might be a major factor, right? So we might have to always design new gesture sets just because the device offers slightly different tracking. How do you see that? I mean, ideally, especially the ones you showed now with your hands, I mean, I can imagine if you use the Ring or you use Soli, some of them work better and others not. So you might have to change the gesture set based on the tracking device, whereas that's maybe not what the user normally would like to have, right? They would like to use always the same set and independently from the device. So how do you see that actually?
That's right. So this is referred to as the problem of transferability. Let's imagine that here we have that one. So we came up with a consensus set here for the Ring device. That's one device, but as you can imagine, some gestures are completely specific to that device, and some others are completely specific to the Google Soli here, because here in this case the person is not wearing anything, since it is based on radar, and the gestures are so-called micro gestures. So the problem that you're raising, Bert, is a problem of transferability.
Okay. Good.
If somebody learns a gesture for an action on one device, in principle, this gesture should be transferred to another device as well. Otherwise, there is
should that not also be a factor then that you take? So transferability you also take as a factor, I assume, to say if I have a gesture set and it is highly transferable, then it has also a higher, it's maybe a better one because you can use it on different devices, right?
That's right.
Okay.
To the best of my knowledge, today nobody has really tackled the question of transferability.
Okay.
Usually people do that. Okay, for instance, here Google released this Soli device, which is nice. Then we came up with a series of gestures for that. Fine. But if I'm using another technology, maybe some of these gestures will remain the same, or maybe they will be completely different. But the more different they are, or the more gestures I have, the less memorable they are.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I meant. So ideally, in terms of having something very natural, you would say the user just memorize, like one for volume up or down or something like that. Should maybe always be the same, even if you use different devices. But okay, then we should actually take that maybe also as one of the major factors to say,
right.
Okay,
so
I have my 20 gestures and they work on most of the devices somehow. Yeah?
You're completely right. Actually, on the last slide of my conclusion, the factor of transferability is one of them.
Okay.
But also consistency is that, of course, if you say this is a gesture for going next, but in principle, the symmetric gesture should be proposed for the symmetric action in the other way around, but it's not done that all the time. Sometimes people say, okay, this is for next slide, and some others say, okay, this is for the previous slide. So it's completely different.
Thank you.
Are you going to explain how you do this arbitrage between what comes up from the elicitation studies and those more higher level principles like consistency or transferability? Because in some way you may go against the democratic choice of the users.
That's right. So again, I can go already to the conclusion of my presentation, which is about that, but we can go back later on. Okay. Is that if we consider all the factors that need to be considered, of course we can consider many different factors. So basically, we took into account the preference, like we did before. Now we can take into account the agreement, which is another factor, but there are more others, like the consistency between them. And as you said, Denis, maybe we can, even if the gestures are probably the most agreed upon people, they could come up with inconsistent gestures. So in this case, we have to perform another type of study, but I will come back on that. It is the inverse. It is so-called framed guessability, which means that we first identify a set of potential gestures, and then in a second study, maybe after a focus group, people have to pick the one that they think it is the most appropriate, but from a subset. So not from all possible gestures, but from a subset.
Okay, thank you.
So the key question is that we can't, at least myself, I can't answer the question, how can I come up with the best gestures? Because each time we can say, okay, we'll try to maximize the preference, or we can work on the agreement, or we can work on the transferability, or we can work on the consistency. There are so many criteria, so many factors, that it is, of course, impossible to take them into account in some way. So I have the key thing now is really to list them and to say, okay, I will maybe focus on consistency and agreement. And which one do you consider the most important? Do you think that consistency is more important than agreement, or vice versa? According to your experience, would you say that consistency is a more important factor?
That's a question for me?
For you or for anybody.
Yeah, I think so, yes, indeed.
Probably consistency is more important than agreement.
Yes. Yeah,
so maybe I would prefer consistent gesture, even if they are not agreed, than maybe gesture which are agreed, but not consistent.
Yes, that's what I worked upon at Airbus, cognitive complexity. It was looking into this kind of regularities within the autopilot. It's exactly the same thing. So this symmetric relationship, for example, this is about order in your data. Okay, no, for me that's very important because it makes things far easier to remember. And you can deduce one half of the set from the other half if you use symmetric.
This is the famous principle, learn once, use many, right? So
Okay.
one of the drawbacks of this kind of study is that, of course, I can come up with gestures that are agreed among people, but this may be not enough. Thank you very much for your question. And any other comment or question? Not for the moment. So let me go back to I think I was here. Okay. Maybe not so far away. So this is the conclusion already of today. So let's go back now. I wanted to show you an example of, but I will be quick on that. I prefer to maybe to go to the discussion about that later on. Just a minute. Okay, not that one. Okay. So here is an example. Oh, I have too many screens. As you can see, I don't have enough gestures in order to manage all the screens that I want. Okay, let's take the main one. Okay. So here is an example of such a study that was supposed to come up with a consensus set of gestures involving the head and the shoulders. So quickly speaking, a head gesture is any movement, of course, of the head, and the shoulder we can move, of course, also of the head. So there are some particular cases where having gesture involving the head and or the shoulders are appropriate. So for that, we need to know that this is coming from medicine. If we have a head, we have a frontal plane where we can pitch, and this is also the case in aviation. So then it should be very familiar with pitch, yaw, and roll, right? Then in sagittal plane, which is sagittal comes from Latin. Sagitta is mean the plane. And the last one is, of course, the transverse, if I'm cutting my body horizontally. So basically, we can move our head or shoulders in any of those, according to any of those dimensions. So that's from a physical point of view. And we can have all of these possible. So there are some cases where what I'm calling head and shoulders gesture are interesting. Of course, head and shoulders has nothing to do with a brand that is copyrighted here. And let's imagine that this is not work done by us, it's work done by a Chinese researcher. Her name is Qinji. And what she did is that while a person is playing the piano, and while this person is looking at the notes or the partition of the notes that is displayed on a tablet, since of course the hands are busy, of course, maybe when you're playing the piano, I'm not a pianist, so I don't know exactly, but while I'm learning playing the piano, I should at some point, if I have a physical book, then I have to flip the pages, and usually I have to do that very quickly. But if I am a tablet, I cannot flip the page to say next page or slowly or faster, etc. So what she did in this paper is that she used head and shoulders in order to manipulate or to visualize, to move the music partition displayed on a tablet. So she used basically, as you can see here, basically 6 gestures with the 2 directions, like left, right, bottom, top to bottom. And then based on that, she reached a very good recognition rate. Is that, as you can see, most of the time is about 90%. So it's very good detection and very good recognition. So not many confusion. But that's for 6 gestures. Technically, we can use many gestures with our heads and shoulders, not just in exercise. So what we did in order to better understand the head and shoulder gestures, we came up with a complete vocabulary of all physical movements. And this was really tough because we had to talk with physicians, especially in orthopedics, in order to better understand all the possible gestures. So for instance, if I say on XYZ translation, then we have different types of gestures. So if you can have a look at my camera, for instance, face left, I should do something like this, or right, left, up, down, thrust or retreat, thrust, retreat. But as you can see, those gestures are not very, although we can do it, I'm not sure that many people will do such gesture because they are physically demanding. Like for instance, face right, face left, face right. Well, maybe I can do a few times, but not many times. And this is the same for others. Like for instance, bending left, bending right, bending up, down, backward, forward. And all of these gestures coming from medicine, they have a specific name like lateral flexion, extension, or whatever. And same for the last part. This was also a very interesting one, is that, for instance, with only the head, we can bend the head forward or backward by keeping just the neck constant. So just like this. Or I can allow the neck to move, so I can do a little bit more, or even with the torso. So if I'm trying to categorize all of these gestures, I have a lot of possibilities. Or even more, I can contract with the shoulder, decontract, raise one shoulder, raise the left or lower one, or raise the two, or protract, retract. So there are many gestures. I will not explain all of them, or I can move my head counterclockwise or clockwise. So this is a typical gesture that is made in physics, especially if you are skiing, for instance, in order to relax the neck. Surprisingly, for instance, so that on the one hand, we came up with the complete vocabulary of all possible gestures. But on the other hand, only a few gestures are actually used in applications. So again, on GestureML, but it looks like it is down now, they come up only with 5 gestures, which are those ones. So in order to decide finally which gesture do we have to use, because maybe having just 5 head and shoulder gestures is probably too few, but supporting all of them here is just too much. So we completed gesture elicitation. So maybe I will skip the detail. For 14 references, we categorize them into categories. And we saw that for some gestures, they were very quick. Like for instance, to go to previous, people were very quick in thinking and they were pretty happy. But for some others, like turning the heating system, they took some time, up to 20 seconds, and they were not so happy, 6 on 10. This I will skip. Then we have to categorize according to, we can do many categorization, like what we notice is that most of the time people involve their head in 50%, then in 30% only the shoulders, and in the rest head and shoulders at the same time. So head, of course, is more mobile than the shoulders. And again, we came up with the agreement. So here, for instance, we compute the agreement rate, and we can see that for go to next channel, moving the head left and right was the most agreed gesture. So in the end of this study, we came up with a lot of possible gestures, but only 10 categories, and a consensus set of finally 14 gestures. So this is the good, I would say, at least a viable set of gestures, because it is not as simple as we had here in gesture ML, because having just 5 is not probably enough, but having all of this is just too much neither, is not good neither. So finally we had 14 gestures. So now I'd like to finish a little bit by criticizing this approach. Although, as you can see, it is very easy, it is cheap to run, it is quick, still there are some shortcomings. And then some people are working on trying to improve this method. First of them is called the legacy bias, which means that when we ask people, please give me a gesture for turning the TV on with the Ring device. And people don't know, or they don't have any creativity, or they're running out of imagination, so they're coming back to what they know. So maybe turning a button. So the legacy bias, introduced by Maurice, says that it is a limitation of the method because people don't know what to do, so they are trying to reproduce what they already know without thinking about a new appropriate gesture. So legacy bias is pretty common. For instance, if they say the pinch in, pinch out, it's a very good gesture, but maybe in 3D this is not so good. We don't know. A second disadvantage is that usually the classification is manual, it's performed by humans, so it is variable. Well, this I would probably skip. Here is an example of another study performed by Radu Vatavu. He asked several children, here 30 students, please give me a full body gesture for the reference scratch like a cat. So according to the criteria, we came up, if it is with the hand, then the agreement is very high, 40%. If it is the hand and the body, the agreement now is decreasing until 20%. And if we impose more criteria, then the agreement is really decreasing until here 12%. So from the same set of initial gestures, if we choose different classification, we can come up with a very good agreement or with a very low agreement, which is not very good, of course. So this is why Radu introduced, I will not detail that, but just the principle, introduced a function called dissimilarity function, which can compute the classification automatically. So in this case, this is the formula. The principle is that two gestures are considered similar or identical to some extent with a tolerance. So for instance, here you have a curve showing that there is a consensus that is very high between two gestures if the dissimilarity function is low. So it should be here. On the other hand, the consensus should be low if the dissimilarity function is high. So the difference is that instead of having a manual classification, it can be automated. But of course, we don't know yet to what extent we can automate that. Another shortcoming is that we can perform an open elicitation or a closed one. The open is that, of course, we present people with reference, like, oh, not like that, I'm sorry. We present people with reference, like say, please give me a gesture for broadcasting. So this is before and after, or this is the remote version. So they propose, in the open case, they propose gestures. Here are some screenshots from gestures performed on the triple monitor. But in this case, while it is open, which is an advantage, because people can do many things, they can do whatever they want, the drawback of that is that instead of having maybe 5 gestures, we can come up with hundreds of different gestures, and then it's just unmanageable. So instead of doing so, we can perform the other way around, which is a little bit what we have been discussing before, is that first we perform an open elicitation, so we come up with a limited set of possibilities. And then we ask in a second step, from this step now, please assign a gesture from this subset to any action. For instance, you may want to say, this gesture is assigned to switch. So instead of starting from an open vocabulary, the vocabulary is closed. And then we can see that usually the agreement rate increases by at more or less 30% from what we know. Gestural elicitation is that, especially now with the time of COVID, is that it's not always possible to gather people in the same location for half an hour or for an hour. So we developed an application called Gestman that can be used for capturing gestures by people, but only two strokes, two stroke gestures, not 3D strokes. So this looks like this. So this application enables to capture a gesture by people who are working remotely on the web. So here is an example. We ask people to create gesture for different reference, like it could be for shapes, for letters, for symbols. And we ask them, please provide some samples of the gestures for that. So here we create a new class. I don't remember the name, or we can have a look at class of gestures that are already there. Looking for class of gesture. Here it is a circle or a square, and then we can see, if you can see here, there are several candidates of square or rectangles which have been produced by different users. So here in my user interface, we have collected gesture from different participants. Triangle, you can see these are very different, but they are all triangles in principle. And for each we can identify who is the user who has produced it, and then we have a series of features like the one Beat will recognize the features from Rubine and some others. So that's the first step. Then we can ask people, please give us some gesture for that, and we can add any new gestures as we want. Like we can ask maybe one per person or several. And the manager can, of course, keep any proposal from a participant or discard it, depending on what is the quality of the result. The system can also simulate different devices with screen resolution, like if you want to capture a gesture on a tablet, on a smartphone, or on a large screen. Then we can manage all of these gestures in two classes with different parameters. So basically, it is a way to capture gestures by people who are acting remotely. And of course, since it is asynchronous, they can capture that at their earliest convenience. And in the end, we can review them and we can accept or reject or even compare. Like for instance, here is that for the reference, you have to turn the TV on. So before the TV is of course switched off, after it is switched on, and here it is open, so you can draw a gesture for performing this action, or you can pick one from an existing set. When you are happy with that, I can say to what extent I'm happy with it, so I have the goodness of it, whether I've used my right hand, my left hand, or both, or any comment. Well, the advantage of that application is that I can use it. It's a web application on the cloud, and I can gather many gestures. But it only works with 2D gestures. If I'm switching to more let's say, advanced gestures, it is very difficult. Like, for instance, KU Leuven has developed a very interesting device called the interactive cushion, which is a sensor that is sensitive to pressure or folding. So we can equip a cushion with sensors, so as to say whether we fold it, or we crush it, or we expand it, or we touch a corner, etc. And again, there are many possibilities. So in this case, what we did is, instead of asking people, please give me a gesture with the cushion for turning your TV, we don't say anything. We just ask them, please give me some gestures. And recently, for instance, with one of our colleagues, I think this is the one, he performed that even in the street, so in the wild. I hope that the video is coming up. Yes. So it is performing this here in the class. So here is a colleague who is professor of computer science at University of Kinshasa, and of course, he has not the real device. So he gave a real cushion, and then he asked people in front of the class, please give me a gesture on the cushion in order to switch the TV on. So he's moving the cushion as it is a real one. Of course, this one is not equipped with the sensor. So then with another one. So everyone has to participate in the wild. But in this case, the gestures were captured only by video, not with the system. Like pushing, pressing, holding, returning. What is very nice here is that it is completely unconstrained. So when it is unconstrained, I'm using a so-called reference tree. We just ask people, please give us the gesture that you want, whatever you want. So this is very much open. From a recent study performed by Santiago, we can see that, of course, some parts of the human body are more covered than some others, like usually the hands or the forearms, the torso, but there are some other parts which are not very much covered by gestures, even if we can capture full body. Now, here I have very much emphasized the use of the gesture elicitation, but we can use the same study for other things than gestures, or even some more modalities. So here is an example of an application that is called Gambit, that has been developed by Hugo Sangiorgi, who is here on the right, which is an application for sketching an application, but it's completely distributed. It means one person can draw something on a tabletop, while the other one is drawing a small thing on a smartphone, and other people who are acting remotely, we can see what they are sketching or drawing, and then they complete the website by arranging the web page. So in this case, instead of having a transition by, let's say, a point and click, this guy is replacing the point and click by a gesture. And the gesture can be performed on the table or on the tactile screen. Or here is another example of for one action, the same user perform a simple gesture on a touchpad and a mid-air gesture on a screen equipped with not just the touchpad, but also with a lip motion. So again, this is the problem of transferability, is that this person gave a 2D gesture for one action and a 3D gesture for the same action. And we don't know to what extent they are related to each other. Again, consistency and transferability. So in conclusion, I wanted to say that elicitation study is very practical, it's easy, it's straightforward, but there are some limitations. And today there are many gesture elicitation studies, so Santiago is trying to consolidate that into one single piece of knowledge. For instance, this is a graph showing that the amount of such studies is really increasing over years. And today we are counting about almost 300 of them. So the question now is how to consolidate this knowledge. So I wanted to finish again by saying, before the discussion, that again, we have been talking about how to maximize preference, how to take into account agreement, how to take into account the similarity between gestures or dissimilarity, to what extent we can recognize those gestures, but there are many other factors to take into account. And the key thing now is not just to recognize or to acknowledge these factors, but also to say which one is more important. So for instance, Denis said that consistency is probably more important than maybe memorability, because the more consistent, the more memorable they are, and not the other way around. But if I'm designing gesture for a game, maybe the preference or the agreement is not the key thing. Maybe this is the hedonic value, which is the pleasure that I may want to feel while I'm acting. So if I can make a very funny gestures, maybe, then the hedonic value will be high, but maybe consistency will be low. Next week, we will also come back on, so we can still continue discussing all of these human factors. And still today, we don't have any list of those factors. Some people are working on discoverability, some other people are working on congruence, some other people are working on transferability. What we can do on the system side is that, of course, we can improve the rate, or we can minimize the execution time, or take into account the complexity, and there are more measures to come. But this is for next week, when we will try to use model and also measures in order to evaluate the gestural interaction. So this is the conclusion for today. Thank you very much for attending, and now I would like to give you the word so that you can comment, criticize, analyze, or suggest any further avenue on that. So please feel free to ask any question if you like.
Maybe one related to the last slide you showed, Jean, and also what you explained today with the agreement, because that was part of the whole elicitation study. But then last week, I think we also discussed a bit that we might even have individual sets of gestures, right? So what would you say in that case? Then the agreement is not that important, right? Because everybody could have their individual gestures, and we even said they could evolve over time, actually. So how do you see that? This on the one hand, today we tried to have an agreement on the gestures, but last week we also said it could be more individual, actually, that you can customize it.
That's right, but that's the preference, and the preference is individual.
Okay, I see.
The agreement is a little bit more advanced than preference. Preference is individual. Agreement is agreement among a set of people.
Okay, yeah.
So it's already one step further, but yet, even I can have a set of gestures which are agreed among people, but maybe they are not consistent, or they are not so easy to remember, or they are not so natural, or maybe not. So this is why up to now we have put a lot of emphasis on some factors like agreement or similarity, but for others, for instance, I know only one person who have been talking about consistency of gestures, but transferability we don't know yet. So if one person, like in my example here, where is my, okay. So in this example, we asked participants to provide a gesture with different devices, but for the same action. And sometimes those gestures are completely inconsistent. Like this person, as far as I remember, on a touchpad, she just touched the touchpad, So that was it's a tap gesture, so it's very simple. But when it came up to propose a gesture in mid-air interaction, the gesture was much more sophisticated. It was like a movement in the air, like moving the hand around. So it is very difficult then to find out the relationship between those two gestures, although this one is a flat 2D and this one is a 3D in space. So the question of transferability is not solved today.
Yeah. Yeah, I think even the size then, right? Even if you would do the same gesture, depending on how large you do the gesture, it might also not work again, right? That's also maybe part. So not only the device and the tracking, but even whether you do it very small and you do the gesture, or whether you would have to do it much larger on a larger board. I think then you might also switch to another gesture, I can imagine.
Mm-hmm. That's right. One thing that we are working on, like again with this example, is that, but of course it depends on the capabilities of the device. The 3D touchpad is an interesting device because you can perform flat 2D gesture on the surface, but also some mid-air gesture, but it should be always on top of the gesture. So here in this case, the person also went out of the cone that is supported by the device. So this means that this gesture will not be recognized by the touchpad unless we have very sophisticated recognition, of course. So if it is a device like this one, which can recognize 2D gestures and 3D gestures in the same way, but that's a challenging, of course, that's the challenge, then we can come up with the question of transferability. But otherwise, if different devices have different capabilities, it's very difficult, challenging to say that this set of gestures should be the common one, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Does this answer your question, or at least?
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, it's from early. So I think ideally, of course, it's all these limitations from the technology. In the future, they will hopefully not be there, right? As you said now, that the user has to know this imaginary boundary. I think this is a restriction that should, in theory, not be there, right? So ideally, in the future, you can do these gestures, and then they will be transferable. I mean, I was less thinking from 2D to 3D. That's yet another interesting question, I think. Yeah, but even that, at least independently of on which technology you use for the tracking, that at least you can consistently use it. Not that the device gives you some constraints and that you have to, as a user, switch because the device can actually not decently track it, right? I think that was. I mean, that's of course the situation today, but I think in an ideal future, you should be able to always use the same 2D gestures, right?
That's right. Or even the nice thing again with this, I really like this 3D touchpad because not only you can perform 2D gesture on the surface, but also 3D gesture, but provided, of course, that I am not far away from the surface, or the so-called air plus touch or touch plus air. Like for instance, if this person is performing a 2D gesture here and then something on top of it here, then it's a combination. It is touch on the surface plus air on top of it.
Okay.
Or in the other way around, is that she can perform in this way, a small gesture here and then coming to the surface and then finish it there. So this is air plus touch. And then combinations are infinite, is that you can have touch plus air plus touch, touch plus air plus touch, and there are many combinations. Or even with different surfaces, is that you can have touch plus air plus touch, and then the touch are two different surfaces, and then come back here. But this is even more tricky, I would say. This is something that we are investigating right now, but this is something that is tricky. It's not just using one device, but you can have, or you can have here, this case, it's air plus touch, but touch on the tactile screen. But if you want, let's say, imagine that I want to copy paste something. I can probably touch the object here, then provide a copy gesture in the air, and then paste it onto another surface. So in case it will be a touch plus air plus touch. And many combinations to be yet explored on that. And you can imagine touch plus touch plus touch plus air plus touch plus air. As many as you want, or even more, or move.
So there are many papers to be written then about.
We can automatically generate papers with all the gestures.
Right.
Are you going to speak next week of how you evaluate these set of gestures and their functions? So the talk was mostly about how do we design these set of gestures and their mapping, but once they are put in practice by real users in real situations, are there evaluations which compare the value of these sets and maybe compare the methods? And conclude that some methods and maybe like this, if you inject consistency, maybe the final result is better, and it's provable in terms of performance, but also user preference, satisfaction, for example.
Yes, but that's a big all. I mean, today our knowledge is incomplete in that we cannot do what you are saying. First, there is no, I would say, established method for evaluating gesture interaction. The only thing that we can do, and this is something that I will, of course, highlight next week, is that, of course, we can take into account some metrics like hedonic value, memorability, consistency, but designing and recognizing a set of gestures like that is much more than just adding one factor on top of another. And as you said, maybe I can come up with a set of very well agreed gestures, but which are not consistent. So if I'm adding consistent to agreement, what would be the impact?
Yes, but these are considerations that you apply at the design stage. But once you put things in practice, what is really useful is maybe the level of performance of users. You ask them to perform some complex tasks, and you measure the time it takes for them to do it. And maybe you would have problems of recognition rates and so on by the system. So this performance measure includes a lot of these factors. And also user satisfaction. I like it, I don't like it. And also the notion that we evoked last week of evolution. Maybe your set is going to naturally evolve into something which is an optimization of what you have designed. That's what we have with languages. They evolve naturally and they reach an optimum. So the design itself, process itself is not finished.
No,
so
it's
there
a never-ending story.
That? Yes, but are there studies about that? Because otherwise you have no feedback about the quality of what you are doing.
No. As far as I know, there is no evaluation method that does that. So what we know today is that, of course, we can have a look at execution time or, as you said, completion task completion time or rate.
Yes.
So these are practical measures, which are, of course, interesting because we can capture them, we can reason about them. But in order to turn the results of those measures into a new design decision, like maybe to improve the gesture set or to discard a gesture that finally is not so good and to replace it by another one, that's not a process that is now established with a procedure.
Okay.
So all what we can do is that we can do it manually. If you remember in my example at the beginning of the presentation, when I was presenting Sketch XML, at some point the designer decided to introduce his own representation of the widget because he was not happy.
Yes, but it's a pity because once you put things in practice, in the real world, you get a lot of data points and you can use them. You know of Tesla. I spoke about Elon Musk the last time, but and you have a Tesla, so you know they are using the car as a means to get a lot of data to improve their recognition system. So so the design does not stop when at the design stage. You get the feedback from real life exploitation, and you reinject that into the designed results.
And you can do that also with crowdsourcing. Is that, of course, is not just with one user. If one user changed the gesture A into gesture B, that's one user. But if several of them are replacing gesture A by gesture B or something else, and then we did that, but not with gestures. Maybe if you allow me a few seconds, maybe I'll try to find out. This is something that we tried with another system that was for adaptive interface. Let me see if I can find it. Yes, this is that one. So here was a very simple question: is which widget is the best for representing data? So the system initially proposed, well, according to rules coming from usability, the so-called best widget for displaying data. So let's say going down. So the system automatically generates a user interface with good widgets. And well, I'm skipping the technical part. And after a while, what was really interesting is that after some time, people were allowed to change the user interface according to what they want. And here you have bars showing how many times people changed a widget by another one and how the system has recorded that and proposed that for next time. So what is interesting is that, for instance, in this case for the last name, there were two users. One user changed it once and then was happy with it and didn't change anymore. But the second, after, I don't remember, maybe the time or maybe the number of task session, the user number one changed and agreed with the second one, but then later on changed again. So each bar represents a change of that, so it's a kind of evolution step. What is interesting is that for some of them, like here, for instance, people change several times, but after a while, they no longer want to change because they kind of converge to a solution that was good enough for them. Like for instance here, for displaying the maximum, I don't remember the widget, but they came to a situations where there were no more evolution. So it was like a convergence. But on the other side, here you can see that there were many evolutions over time. And the system has captured that and reintroduced this as a new rule. So this was done for a graphical user interface with a system called WISEL. But we didn't, and you can see that there were some machine learning behind. That's the technical stuff.
Yes, but that's exactly that.
That was done only for one small question, how to select the widget, and for graphical user interface. We didn't do that for gestures.
Of course, yes, but that's the idea. Once you put things in practice, you get a lot of data points which have a high value.
Right. But now, let's imagine that we are in this position, and I think we can capture all of these points. But now, how to feed back this information back into the design process?
That's a lot of papers to write.
That's really the tough thing. Manually, we can do it, but in a principle-based way, maybe with a method and a tool, that's for a future PhD thesis, or maybe several of them. Okay, I see that it's 7:07, but anyway, we can continue the discussion unless maybe I'll stop the recording now. Unless you have other interesting questions or comments.
It's okay. I just also in the comments I just posted the link to GestureML, but an old version via archive.org. So for everybody who might be interested, you can still access it from there. And maybe I can also post in the. Let me see.
Yes, please. That's strange because this website has been alive for many years.
Yeah.
And now suddenly it disappeared. I don't know why.
Maybe also
but it is true that it has been alive and being updated on a regular basis for some months. And then after a while, I didn't see any update anymore.
I think Maxime had it's maybe not the site, but just the domain actually. Maybe they didn't pay their bill, so maybe it will be up. So that was just a week ago or something. A few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago or something like that. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So that it might come again. Maybe they didn't realize it. I also post the link again to the page itself, where actually now we have already the videos from the last 2 lectures and the slides of today, but we also plan to add the slides from the previous lecture. So if you want to go back, if you were maybe not present or you want to use it later for your own lectures or whatever, we try to put most of the material on that website also.
Okay, but then thank you very much for joining us tonight and for your comments and your participation. I will stop now the recording that will be made available also